For 30 years, Johnny Carson was America's midnight companion. His charm, quick wit, and iconic Tonight Show couch became the stage where Hollywood royalty mingled with ordinary oddballs. Viewers saw laughter, warmth, and easy banter. What they didn't see was Johnny's private judgment of the people sitting across from him. Carson was famously discreet, but when the cameras turned off, he sometimes leaned over to Ed McMahon and muttered something unforgettable. He didn't just think some guests were difficult or temperamental. He thought a select few were downright rotten. People who hid behind charm and fame while treating others with cruelty. Over the years, Carson revealed to friends and colleagues which stars he secretly despised. These weren't minor annoyances. These were household names who, in Carson's eyes, were manipulative, abusive, or just plain dangerous. And tonight, we're going to uncover those names. 9 icons of the so-called golden age of Hollywood, each of whom Carson quietly blacklisted in his own mind. The first, a screen legend who appeared icy on camera and even colder off it. When Joan Crawford appeared on The Tonight Show in 1970, audiences marveled at her elegance, the gowns, the posture, the aura of an untouchable star. But to Carson and his staff, that evening became a cautionary tale. Before she even arrived, Crawford's demands filled several pages. Lighting angles were dictated to the inch. Carson's desk height had to be adjusted by 3 inches. The studio temperature, a rigid 67 degrees, no exceptions. The moment she stepped into the building, she dismissed Carson's Emmy-winning makeup team as unfit and summoned her personal artist. Staff whispered that she didn't trust anyone to even hold a mirror near her. Then came the explosion. A young production assistant, only 20 years old, brought Crawford a glass of water. She had been told it was urgent. When she accidentally entered the dressing room without knocking, Crawford unleashed a verbal attack so brutal it rattled the hallway. She accused the assistant of being brainless and suggested she try working in a brothel. The poor girl fled in tears. Crawford demanded her firing. On air, none of this showed. Crawford smiled, delivered rehearsed lines, and even complimented Johnny's suit. But during breaks, she sat motionless, refusing small talk, eyes fixed on nothing. After the taping, Carson told Ed McMahon, "I've interviewed corpses with more personality." Years later, when Christina Crawford's book Mommy Dearest exposed a lifetime of abuse, Johnny said he wasn't surprised. He'd seen it in her eyes that night. Crawford hid her cruelty behind poise, but the next guest on Carson's blacklist didn't hide anything. He used power and intimidation as a weapon. Frank Sinatra was a ratings magnet. When he came on the show, America tuned in. Viewers saw 2 old-school entertainers trading jokes, sipping whiskey, and swapping war stories. The Johnny's respect for Sinatra's music never translated into respect for the man himself. Sinatra traveled with an entourage that staff nicknamed The Wall. Broad-shouldered men in suits who watched every movement. The atmosphere when he entered was unlike any other guest, a mixture of awe and dread. One infamous night, a floor manager did his job and gave Sinatra the 3-minute warning. Sinatra grabbed the man by his tie, pulled him close, and growled, "Nobody tells me when I've got 3 minutes. I'll go on when I'm ready." The man was a Korean War veteran who had faced combat, yet later admitted he had never felt so threatened. Carson almost canceled the segment. Only the promise of record-breaking ratings convinced him otherwise. But what ended Johnny's tolerance wasn't violence, it was cruelty. During the commercial break, Sinatra made a cutting remark about a female staffer's appearance. Carson turned to him coldly. "We don't talk about my staff that way here." The tension was palpable. When the show resumed, Carson's questions were shorter, his tone sharper. After that night, Carson limited Sinatra's appearances. As he later told a producer, "He's a great singer. That doesn't mean I have to enjoy his company." Sinatra used intimidation. The next name on Carson's list used ego, a genius who thought The Tonight Show was his personal stage. Orson Welles was a legend before he turned 30. Citizen Kane made him immortal. But genius, Carson learned, came with an ego that swallowed entire shows. Welles dismissed Carson's writers as uninspired and refused to even look at their questions. He strutted onto the set and immediately launched into a monologue of his choosing. What was supposed to be a 7-minute segment ballooned to 25. Other guests were bumped. Producers scrambled. Carson's signals to wrap up were ignored. At one point, Welles stood up and instructed a cameraman on which angle to use. He spoke as if he owned the show. Carson, who was a stickler for timing and fairness, fumed privately. To him, Wells's arrogance wasn't just unprofessional, it was disrespectful. Genius doesn't excuse everything, Carson said afterward. You don't hijack someone else's show. Ego was one thing. The next guest weaponized something harsher. Words sharp enough to wound. Bette Davis was a towering actress with eyes that could pierce through glass. On stage, she dazzled audiences with wit, but on Carson's couch, her wit often turned venomous. She interrupted younger guests, mocked new performers, and dismissed their stories with a glare. Once, when a young comedian shared a heartfelt anecdote, Davis leaned into the microphone and said, "That's the dullest thing I've ever heard." The audience laughed. The comedian never returned. Backstage, Davis drank heavily. She berated crew members, calling one cue card holder the slowest idiot in California. Johnny, usually reluctant to confront anyone, stepped in. "Miss Davis, on this show we speak to everyone with respect, or we don't speak at all." Davis blinked, surprised, and briefly softened. Carson admired her acting, but not her cruelty. He told his staff, "I don't need to be flogged by Bette Davis to recognize she's a legend." If Davis's words cut deep, Carson's next nightmare guest used touch, the kind no one wanted. Mickey Rooney's career was once the envy of Hollywood. By the time he appeared with Carson, his reputation was less glamorous. Rooney was notorious among Tonight Show staff for being handsy. Female assistants dreaded being assigned to him. One remembered, he'd grab your hand when you brought him water, pull you close, and whisper questions about your love life. Often, he arrived intoxicated. In one notorious appearance, Rooney launched into a slurred story about Judy Garland that veered into disturbing territory. Carson had to cut him off, shifting abruptly to commercial. Worse still, Rooney directed his behavior toward younger women in the studio. Carson, protective of his staff, personally apologized to one actress. "That's not how professionals act on my show. It won't happen again." Rooney's appearances dwindled after that. As Carson told a friend, "I grew up watching him. I wish I hadn't met him." But while Rooney's behavior was disturbing, the next guest was exhausting. A diva whose demands turned every show into a circus. Zsa Zsa Gabor could light up a room with glamour. She also drained the patience of everyone around her. Her pre-show checklist read like royal decrees. Orchids only in the dressing room, no carnations. The temperature at exactly 74 degrees. Perrier with 3 ice cubes, not 2. And most absurdly, no other female guests under 40 allowed on the same night. When her preferred foundation wasn't available, she refused to leave her dressing room. A frantic assistant drove across Los Angeles to fetch it. Carson finally called her. "Za, darling, you look beautiful already. Let's save the cosmetics emergency for another day." On air, she flirted with Carson, called him Darling Johnny, and the audience loved it. But afterward, Johnny shook his head. "I'd rather interview a cat," he said. "At least it wouldn't demand orchids." But while Gabor drained patience, the next guest tested nerves with unpredictable fury. Shelley Winters was brilliant and terrifying. Instead of charming anecdotes, Winters launched into tirades. One night she railed against Vietnam for nearly 10 minutes straight. Carson, desperate, scanned for a commercial break. Another time, she turned a segment into a rant about corruption in Hollywood. Her volatility wasn't confined to words. On a British talk show, she famously threw whiskey at Oliver Reed. The Tonight Show crew, fearful of a repeat, quietly removed all glassware from the set before she appeared. Carson respected her authenticity, but dreaded her energy. "She's real," he admitted, "but she's a storm you can't stop." Storms could be tolerated, but Johnny drew the line at guests whose views revealed outright hatred. Jane Russell was one of the most glamorous women of the 1940s. By the 1970s, she had reinvented herself as a conservative firebrand. Carson didn't mind politics, but he despised bigotry. Russell openly made disparaging remarks about Rock Hudson's sexuality. She rejected a gay makeup artist, demanding someone more appropriate. When staff hesitated, she threatened to cancel. The final straw came during a commercial break when she dismissed civil rights legislation as nonsense. Carson, visibly cold, wrapped the segment and ensured she was never booked again. Russell had her beliefs, Carson had his standards, and he would not compromise them. But all of these frustrations paled in comparison to the man Carson considered the most hateful guest he ever endured. To the public, Jerry Lewis was a beloved clown. To Carson, he was a menace. Lewis disrupted interviews by dominating conversations, ignoring Carson's questions, and mocking other guests. He once adjusted Carson's tie on live television, a deliberate act of dominance. Off camera, his behavior worsened. He refused to learn staff names, referring to people as camera guy or makeup girl. During one rehearsal, he berated a cameraman for breathing too loud. The man had allergies. Carson's verdict was uncharacteristically harsh. In a town full of phonies, Jerry Lewis stands out as truly hateful, and that takes some doing. After the early 1980s, Lewis was quietly barred from The Tonight Show. Johnny Carson's private blacklist wasn't built on petty dislikes or fragile ego. He had welcomed eccentric guests for decades, from magicians who botched tricks to politicians who droned on endlessly. He even laughed off flubs, walkouts, and technical disasters. What Carson couldn't stomach was cruelty. And in the world of late-night television, where everyone from the star to the stagehand worked shoulder to shoulder, cruelty had nowhere to hide. For Carson, the test was simple. A guest could charm an audience, dazzle the camera, and deliver perfect punchlines. But if they snapped at an assistant, humiliated a staff member, or demeaned someone with no power to fight back, Johnny made his judgment instantly. He believed that how someone treated the lowest person in the room revealed more than any polished performance. Over time, his instincts proved prophetic. Joan Crawford's monstrous behavior was later confirmed by her daughter's memoir. Frank Sinatra's mafia ties and bullying tactics became Hollywood legend. Mickey Rooney's troubling behavior surfaced in stories whispered for years. Jane Russell's bigotry alienated younger audiences, and Jerry Lewis's reputation soured as more colleagues spoke out about his cruelty. Carson's quiet blacklist, never written down but remembered in confidences and side remarks, was less about gossip than about survival. It was his way of protecting the fragile ecosystem of The Tonight Show. The interns, the crew, the writers, people he valued deeply. He understood that television wasn't built only on stars, but on the army of unseen professionals who made the magic possible. To Carson, defending them was part of his job. Perhaps Carson himself summed it up best. In a rare moment of honesty, he told a friend, "The show is an illusion. My job is to keep the illusion going. But when the lights go down, you see who people really are. And some of them, you wouldn't want as a neighbor, let alone a guest."